Good afternoon, everyone. Am I mic'd? Okay. Whoa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be the president of Bismarck State College, and I certainly want to welcome all of you to the campus this must be our third or fourth presentation in this year's series of conversations at Bismarck State College. And we're delighted to have such a wonderful turnout today. We've been trying. I'm very excited today that we've got Dr. Herman Viola here from the Smithsonian. And we've been trying for a couple of years to get him to come out, and he would look at the weather map and would demur each year. So this year we promised him 50, 60-degree temperatures, which we've had until he showed up. So we ended up with just a little taste of winter, but it's not bad. There's something in our DNA, I think, as North Dakotans, that we like a little bit of freshness in the air and a little white now and then. And so the 55 and 60-degree temperatures and all brown just didn't fit right. Now we feel like we're actually in winter, and the good news is that spring is just around the corner. So we're very, very pleased about that. Just some administrative notes. The rest of the program for the year is on the handout that you can pick out as you pick up as you came in or as you're going out. Inside of that, it's really crucial that I point out that our March conversation, the date on it has changed. It is now March 25th. We moved that 1 week out. So please make sure that you note that on your calendars at home for those of you that are regular attendees. We also have an evaluation sheet in there, and we very, very much value the feedback that we get from all of you. And so please take just a moment to fill that out and get that turned into Robin Thorstensen as you leave here, because we really, again, we value the feedback that you give us, and we want to make sure these are community conversations that we have up here at Bismarck State, and we want to ensure that your input, that we take it seriously, and that we make sure that these are of value for all of you to be coming out. So please do that. Okay, I'm going to introduce our distinguished visitor today. I'm going to read some here, and I'm going to interject some of my personal thoughts about it. Before I get started, I do want to say that we could not do programming like this without our sponsors, and so we're really delighted to have the support of Whiting Petroleum Corporation they supported our 9/11 symposium we had in September, and now they're supporting this program. And Shyla Schaefer, who is in attendance today, and we appreciate her support of this programming that is run through the BSC Foundation. We really appreciate Mary Van Sickle and her whole team over at Cable Access Channel 12. All of these programs are viewable, if that's such a word, on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock. And the public access folks have been really helpful to us. They've lent us equipment to help us do some of this some of the technology that we do here, and we appreciate Mary Van Sickle and her team. We are currently live streaming, so we want to say hello to all those out there in the world on the web that may have tuned in to us today. And we really enjoy that the next day we actually get a report on where people sign in, and we get people sign in from Washington State and Virginia and all around the country. And there's somebody in Australia that watches us, so whoever's out there in Australia watching us, we want to say hi to you especially. Herman J. Viola is the Curator Emeritus with the Smithsonian Institution. He received his Ph.D. in American History from Indiana University. He founded the scholarly journal Prologue at the National Archives and then served as director of the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian Institution, where he also developed two major exhibits, Magnificent Voyagers and Seeds of Change. A nationally recognized authority on the Lewis and Clark expedition and the history of the American West, he is the author of a number of books, and I'm not going to read a complete list, but just to give you an idea of how distinguished our visitor is, I thought I would read off a quick list of the books that he has published. Thomas L. McKinney, Architect of America's Early Indian Policy, The Indian Legacy of Charles Beard King, Diplomats in Buckskin, and I want to stop on that. And if you read none other of the publications of Dr. Viola, Diplomats in Buckskin is such an engaging story. When we think about diplomatic history here in the United States, we often end up talking about Germans and Americans, English and Americans, French and Americans, and so forth. But there was an entire other diplomatic history going on, and that was between native nations and the United States. And I think this is probably the only thorough study on that piece of our diplomatic history, and it's an engaging book, and I certainly highly recommend it. He's also written the National Archives of the United States, Magnificent Voyagers, Exploring the West, After Columbus, Seeds of Change, did a biography on Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who is the former senator from the state of Colorado, the memoirs of Charles Henry Vail, the North American Indians, Warrior Artists, Why We Remember, Little Bighorn Remembered, the untold Indian story of Custer's Last Stand, Trail to Wounded Knee, Facing the Lion, Counting Coup, and the book that he will be talking to us about today, Warriors in Uniform. I also want to point out, and I think this has been a very, very important part of Dr. Viola's contribution to history and contribution to relations with our native nations in the United States. From 1972 until 1987, Dr. Viola was director of the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian, which is responsible for collecting and preserving materials relating to the history of anthropology. As part of his duties, he also supervised the Human Studies Film Archives, which is charged with collecting and preserving ethnographic film. As director, Dr. Viola initiated the Smithsonian's first intern program for American Indians. Titled the Native American Culture Resources Training Program, it provided internships to 70 Native American men and women from 55 tribes interested in becoming tribal archivists, librarians, and historians. It's a tremendous contribution. And so please give a good Bismarck welcome to our guest, Dr. Herman J. Viola.
Well, greetings. Can you all hear me? Is the mic on? I have a very soft voice. First, I want to say how impressed I am with the turnout. Right now, my wife Susan and I live in Falls Church, Virginia, and they tend to even close schools and events with the prediction of snow. And here you all came out in snow. So anyhow, I'm delighted to be here. I actually feel like I'm almost at home. Larry and I go back some 25 years. Clay Jenkinson came from Virginia for a while. And so I have spent a lot of time out here in different parts of the area, especially working with Indian people. So I feel like I'm at home. But what I'm going to do today is talk about Indians in the military. And it's a story that, most people have a sense of, but I think I'm still a relatively untold story, because I grew up, I'm sure you all did too, with the idea of cowboys and Indians. The Indians were always the people you were fighting against. And the truth is, from the days of George Washington, Indians were on our side. They were with us in every battle, every war. At this moment, Indians are more highly represented in the military percentage-wise than any other group in the United States. And the other thing about them is that the communities value their veterans so much. I can't tell you how many times Indian people have told me how sorry they feel for their non-Indian brethren in the military, because when they come home to no jobs, they come home to sometimes ridicule, but in Indian communities, they are always welcomed, they are always honored, and they really commemorate them. They make songs for them. There's so many ways Indians are welcomed. And I think the greater community could learn a bit from our Indian friends. So let me see if all this works now. And I'm always technologically challenged. So what I'm going to be showing you are a lot of pictures I've gotten from the Smithsonian. Some of them are pictures I've taken myself. But I've been working on this project actually for something like 25 years. As Larry said, I started this program at the Smithsonian, and these Indian folks would come, and then they invited me to their homes when they spent their couple months in Washington. And I suddenly realized that there was a story out there that none of it was really being recorded, because Indian families talk about, their military heroes, but they don't record these things. They're very humble people. But I'd be in a home and they'd say, oh yeah, Grandpa was there. You heard about, Iwo Jima or whatever. Well, our boys were there. But, they just never really revealed some of the things that were done. But the important thing is that they also carry on their warrior tradition in the military. One of my youth friends said to me one time, he says, Herman, we're so grateful that the United States turned into such a militaristic country. He said, because we can continue to do our war deeds legally. And so they do. They take pride in getting into combat, but they don't take pride in killing the enemy. One of the things they do is counting coup, which means touching an enemy, especially touching an enemy who's armed, and then getting away and talking about it. So, but it's that idea of personal bravery and, bringing honor to your community, protecting your community. And so, like this picture here from the Blacklegging Society, the Kiowas, it's the, blending of two cultures, the traditional Indian culture and the U.S. military. Now, I'll start with this one. I wonder if we need these lights on up here. Is that necessary? Is it too bright? Can you all see okay and everything? Okay, so I got started, and also you got to be careful. I talk too long, and you might want to give me signals about when it's time to stop. Whoops! Oh dear! Oh, I got to go back. Let's see. Okay, there we go.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. So anyhow, I really got started in all this with a man named Joseph Medicine Crow, and he is, I'm not sure what this, he's the fellow on the far right, and he's now 98 years old, did his war deeds against the Germans, but his grandfather was White Man Runs Him, who was one of Custer's scouts at Little Bighorn, and Joe was one of the first Indian people who came into my program, Crow. And they had a dedication of a museum on the reservation back in the 70s, early 70s. And so he wanted me to be there. And so anyhow, here was the honor guard. And then he told me afterwards, well, Herman, he said, you ought to know who those people are in that honor guard. And I said, yeah, I'm curious. He says, we use our veterans. He says, they are the ones that carry the flag when we have a ceremony. And so the fellow on the left is Henry Old Coyote, World War II pilot. But the fellow holding the flag is Andrew Bird in the Ground. And Andrew Bird in the Ground was a hero in World War II, got the Silver Star. Joe said if he'd have been a white man, he'd have gotten the Congressional Medal of Honor. But he was engaged in a fierce battle, and it was a battle in which a number of German soldiers were killed. He triumphed. I said to him once, I said, why did you fight so hard like that? He said, I was so afraid that I would die in a foreign country, and I wanted to be buried at home. So he said, I wanted to make sure I got back. Well, anyhow, Andrew Bird in the Ground became a very spiritual person, but when he got back from the war and they did relate the war deeds, which they still do in Indian communities, because he had had this terrible battle and he had killed all these Germans, the Crow gave him a new name called Kills Many Germans. And so a few years went by, and Henry Old Coyote had a baby born at the Billings Hospital. And the doctor said the baby wouldn't make it, he would die. And so the parents were really anguished, and they went to Andrew then, who was very spiritual, and they said, Andrew, God really must love you because you survived that terrible battle, and would you mind going to the Billings Hospital and praying for our son? And he said, well, of course. And so he went over there and prayed, and in his ceremony that he did with the baby, he then transferred his name, Kills Many Germans, to the baby. And Kenneth survived. And Kenneth not only survived, he went to Vietnam, where he got the Bronze Star for rescuing 2 boys who had been wounded in battle. And so this is what this is all about, this carrying on these traditions, sharing the traditions, honoring your people. But of course, Indians have been in the military since the days of George Washington. George Washington recruited 2,000 soldiers from mostly Delawares. He said, we want this kind of combat success on our side, not have the British use the Indians. And Battle of New Orleans. We all know about Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans. We don't talk about the Indians who were fighting with him. And one of those Indians was Pushmataha, who was a Choctaw chief, but became an actual general in the United States Army. And when he came to Washington, Larry mentioned my book, Diplomats and Buckskins. Well, he was one of these delegates who came to D.C., and he died on Christmas Eve, 1824, and he's buried in Congressional Cemetery, which is the cemetery where the congressmen were buried in those days before we had ways to take care of the dead. They had to have a place to bury them right away. And so he's there, and he is one of like 30 Indian leaders who are buried in Washington, D.C., who died on official business with the federal government. But they said his funeral cortege was the largest the city had seen at that time, and Andrew Jackson led the cortege. And so here's Pushmataha's grave. And if you ever get a chance to visit Washington, D.C., you ought to go to there. The cemetery is only about 2 miles from the Capitol, but almost no one visits it. It's not in any of the tourist sites, but it's really a microcosm of American history. So anyhow, Indians were always in uniform. When the Civil War came, Indians enlisted both for the North and the South. And of course, the highest ranking Indian officer in the Civil War was Eli Parker, was a general, but he was on Grant's staff. And here he is now. He, in fact, wrote the surrender documents for Lee at Appomattox. And one of the other officers said the reason, he's a NIDA, he said the reason he got that task is he had the best handwriting of all of us. So he wrote the surrender documents. But Stand Watie was the highest ranking Confederate Indian. And so the Confederacy had a large number of Indian soldiers. And in fact, the biggest Indian battle in the United States was the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, where there were about 15,000 Indians in uniform for both the North and the South fighting. The Indians were in uniform. Like I said, they've been in uniform for all of us, even for the Confederacy, but they were there. And of course, we come up to your local history, Little Bighorn. Well, we always look at that as, again, cowboys versus Indians. What we don't realize is that Custer had about 100 Indian allies, soldiers. He had 6 Crow Scouts with him at the end. He had a large number of Arikaras with him. And for the Indians, they actually look at it as Indians against Indians, because the Crows were the deadly enemies of the Lakota. And so they really, Joe Medicine Crow, whose grandfather was there, said, we just felt we were a small tribe and we had to get our allies wherever we could, so we thought we'd get the U.S. government on our side. And that's why they really joined forces with Custer. So anyhow, Joe's grandfather was a white man runs him. And Joe is just an amazing person. He personally knew 4 of the 6 scouts. And when he was a young boy, he was one of the first kids on the reservation to go to school, learn English, and he would be the interpreter when historians and Army people came to talk to Grandpa about what happened on June 25th. And so here he is. We're going to hear more about Joe with World War II, but here he is next to his grandpa's grave. And of course, then, all through the 19th century, Indians were involved in the different skirmishes out west, often all Indian units. And they were very prominent fighting the Apaches because it took an Apache to defeat an Apache. And of course, they were the ones who were really instrumental in getting Geronimo at the end, the last big organized conflict. Here's Geronimo surrendering in 1888. Now, Indians were with Teddy Roosevelt in San Juan Hill. They were in all of our engagements. But they generally were in all Indian units. And one of the Army officers said at the end of the 19th century that they just didn't trust Indians. One officer said, we don't think Indians have the basic patriotism it takes to be in a military unit. And so the big thing, though, is that Indians kept enlisting, kept trying to work with us, and even though they weren't citizens of the United States, they enlisted in great numbers. The great breakthrough for the Indians was World War I. They enlisted in huge numbers and went overseas, and this is when the Code Talkers got started. We always think of the Code Talkers with the Navajos in World War II. The Navajos just had a good publicity agent. The Code Talkers really began in World War I, and there were a number of Indians who were in units, and they could speak their native tongue, and the Germans were very good at intercepting messages. And so one of the officers in charge of some Choctaws said, would you mind giving messages in your language? And it worked beautifully. And so in World War I, then, you had Code Talkers who were Osage, you had, you had Choctaws, you had, let's see, who else was in there? Cheyenne, Comanches, Lakotas. And so there were a large number of Indian folks, and so they were all used this way, and that's why when World War II came along, it was not a rocket scientist to say, let's see if we can continue using that ability. But the irony is we were working so hard to convert Indians into white people and taking their languages away. So here at one hand, we're trying to destroy their languages. The other hand, we needed those languages desperately. One of the heroes in World War I was Joseph Oklahombi. He was a Choctaw. He captured something like 150 German soldiers single-handedly, kept them under guard for 4 days, got the French Croix de Guerre. In fact, 10 Indians got the French Legion of Honor medal. None of the Indians got Congressional Medal of Honor, but the French honored them. Of course, then you come up to World War II, and now you do have the Code Talkers. And there were a lot of Navajos, about 300 of them, I think, that were Code Talkers. But there were actually other tribes that were doing the same thing, but the Navajos were the ones that get the publicity. And of course, we all know if you talk about Indians in the military, the one person they talk about is Ira Hayes. So anyhow, Ira Hayes, Pima Indian, is famous because of, Iwo Jima. Now, the irony of this great picture, this great moment, one of my Indian friends who was there said, Herman, he said, the Ira gets all this publicity. He said, but the truth is us Indian guys always hung out together. And when we got up on the top of there, he said, Suribachi, he said, there were about a dozen of us lying around tired, and Rosenthal comes along and says, hey, I need to get a picture. Can we pose for a picture? Who come and volunteer for the picture? And so, Ira Hayes says, okay, I'll do it. But it could have been all American Indians in that photograph. Now, isn't that something? But you don't realize it. But he said, of course, that picture was the worst thing that ever happened to him. And he, of the 6 fellows who put that flag up, I think 3 got killed, a couple got wounded, and he survived. And so Truman brought him back home to do work on victory parades and war bonds. And of course, then he started drinking. He also was very depressed because he said, I shouldn't be treated like a hero. He said, I didn't do anything. All I did was help pose for a picture. And so, as we all know the story, he ended up dying at a very early age, alcoholism, and maybe in his 30s. And so here is his grave at Arlington Cemetery. And the irony is that his grave is within sight of the memorial at Arlington Cemetery. So the grave, the the moment that really led to his destruction, and there he's buried right in the shadow of it. In World War II, you had the Fighting 45th. These were the Thunderbirds out of Oklahoma, almost all Indian, and they were really amazing soldiers. Bill Malden was one of those soldiers in that unit, one of the non-Indians. And if you all remember his cartoons, G.I. Joe cartoons, well, the truth is one of the Joe was his Indian sergeant. He said he was the most squared away soldier I ever knew. And he said he was so impressed with the fellow. And so anyhow, he says that when he wrote his memoirs, and he said the last time he saw his sergeant, he said he was lying dead on the beach at Anzio. And Malden never went to any of these reunions, but he said he went to one eventually, and the 45th Division. And as he walked in, there was his former sergeant, and he walked up to him. He says, "You're supposed to be dead." And he says, "Yeah," he said, "I read your book." So anyhow, here are the couple of cartoons here. And then Ernie Childers, another 45th member, got the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War II. About 5 Indians got the Medal of Honor in World War II. We finally started catching up with them. And here's one of my favorite fellows, Brummett Echohawk. He became a very prominent artist in Oklahoma, died a couple of years ago, and he was in the 45th. And he was a self-taught artist. And so he was in with Childers. In fact, Childers is in this group of pictures that he's marching up this hill. But he started drawing pictures. And he was in Italy, and he would get into house fighting. He'd find paper. And so he started just drawing battlefield sketches. And so they're wonderful. Here are a couple of them. And so they got published in the newspapers, and they were really the first combat drawings to come out of places like Anzio. He got wounded at Anzio, in fact. So he's another one of these unsung heroes. And of course, here's my friend Joe Medicine Crow. And he was in World War II, and he was going to the University of Southern California at the time, and he was working on his PhD in anthropology. And the war broke out, and so he enlisted. And at the recruiting office, one of the people there was one of his college roommates, and he said, "Joe, with your education, I can make you an officer." And Joe, his father had been a war chief, Chief Medicine Crow. He was from a long line of war chiefs. And he thought to himself, he said, in the Indian way, you don't become an officer or a leader unless you've proven yourself in battle. So he said, there was no way in my mind that I could become an officer until I'd been in battle. So he turned down the chance at a commission. He said it was the biggest mistake he ever made. He said, because the U.S. Army doesn't work on the same principles as the Crow Indian tribe. But anyhow, he went over to Germany, and he did his war deeds. The 4 things you had to do to become a chief in the Plains tribes, basically, is, touch an enemy in battle, take his weapon away, lead a successful war party, and in the army, if you were a platoon leader and took your platoon out and they all came back, that was a successful war party. But the important thing was to catch a horse. And Joe, believe it or not, at the end of the war, the Germans were retreating. He was there, and they were going down this road, and they could hear the clop, clop of horse hooves. And so they were tracking a German patrol, and it turned out they were SS officers, and they holed up in a farmhouse. And Joe, he said, we got there, and we surrounded the farmhouse, and he said, there was this corral with about 50 horses in it. And he said, they always called me chief, but I was always the guy that was next to the captain of the company. He said, he always made me do the dangerous things because he thought as an Indian I should be able to do those things. He said I was more scared than those white boys were. But anyhow, he said the captain sat down and he said, okay, fellas, these guys are going to surrender as soon as we show up. He said, we'll wait till dawn and we'll get them. And they're all tired out. We're tired. Well, we'll get them and start shooting first thing in the morning. And Joe said, all I could think about was those horses in that corral. So he said, I went over to the captain and I said, sir, I said, your plan is a very good one, but you know, there are those horses there, and some of those Germans might escape on their horses. Do you think maybe I should go there and get them out of the corral while they're asleep? And he said, the chief, he said, chief? And he said, I could tell the way he looked at me and said it, that he knew what I was up to. He said, yeah, why don't you get those horses out of there? And so Joe says, I crawled over there, got my best friend to be with me, and we untied the gate. And so I said to my friend, I says, when I give a yell, you open that gate. And he said, and I walked in that corral, and he said, and I was touching those horses in the dark, and he says, I found a nice one. But he said, I was so tired, my backpack was so heavy, I had to go to the watering trough to stand on it to get on the horse's back. But he said, I always carried a rope with me, and I made the crow loop around the lower jaw, and then I yelled, I gave the crow war cry. And that gate opened, those horses peeled out of there, and he said, I dashed out, and just as I was coming out, I could hear the gunshots going off, and he said, and I circled those horses around, and I sang a crow war song, and he said, I was so proud, and then I took my horse back to the group, the Germans had surrendered, and then we had to leave and start marching along this railroad track, and he said, I was riding that horse, and my officer says to me, hey, Joe, get off that horse. You make too good a target. But anyhow, he got that horse, and when he came home, he got then honored as a Crow War Chief, and so he is the last official Crow War Chief. And if you remember any of the publicity, President Obama gave him the Congressional Medal of Freedom a couple years ago in recognition not only of his war deeds, but after the war he became very instrumental in trying to work as a liaison between the Indian community and the white community to bring better understanding between groups and in education. But, you know, not all Indians were treated as heroes. In the Korean War, here was a fellow named David Rice, who was a Winnebago, got killed in Korea, and his hometown, Des Moines, Iowa, wouldn't let him be buried in the cemetery. And so when Truman heard about it, he arranged for him to be taken to Washington, D.C. to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. And then here's Carson Walks Over Ice. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. So Carson Walks Over Ice is Crow, and he is the nephew of Joe Medicine Crow. And when I was working on that, I finally got the idea that we ought to put these stories on paper, and I started going around to different reservations, and I showed up on the Crow Reservation, and I said, I'd like to talk to some war veterans, and Mardell Plainfeather says, oh, you got to talk to my nephew. He was in Vietnam, and his safe return was predicted in the Sundance, which it was, and he said he was a real war hero, but of course he never said much. So anyhow, I went to talk to him, and I said, would you be willing to tell me your stories? He said, sure. So we spent several days together chatting, and he was a Green Beret in the war very early on, and so he said, Joe Medicine Crow is my uncle, and I'd grown up on those stories, and I wanted to do him one up. And so Carson did his war deeds, and he, in fact, had a special medicine bundle that a woman had made for him that he wore around his neck. And he said in those days, he said the Viet Cong were very good at shooting anyone that had insignias on. So he always kept an eagle feather in his helmet. He was platoon leader. And so he would give his directions, but he never wore any insignias. And so, but he said like one time, they were looking for this Viet Cong camp. It was along a stream, and he said he directed everybody with hand motions, and then he started moving, and a machine gun started shooting right at him. And he said that machine gun was clipping the grass around me. It took my wristwatch off. It took my St. Christopher's medal off. It took my medicine bundle off, but not a bullet hurt me. And he said, that was a good shot. He says, I got all 4 of those people behind that machine gun. And it turned out they were 4 women soldiers, Viet Cong soldiers. But anyhow, he did all these kinds of things. But he said, I just couldn't get a horse. He said, the darn Viet Cong, he lived behind the lines there for months with his group. And he said, those Viet Cong just didn't have a horse. But he said, one time I was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and he said I was waiting there because that's where the supplies were coming in from the north. And sure enough, here comes an elephant through the brush. And he said, then there was a mahout sitting on it. He says, that was a good shot. He says, I knocked him right off. And, but he said it turned out he was a kid. But suddenly here was this elephant going past me, laden with supplies, and the chain was dragging on the ground. So he says, I grabbed that chain. And he said, Herman, I want you to know that that elephant stopped when it wanted to stop. But I was hanging on, and he dragged me through that brush forever. But finally, when he stopped, I tied him up around a tree with a chain, and it turned out there were 3 other elephants tied to him. And he said, so I had 4 elephants. And so anyhow, but when I went back home, the old people said, nice try, Carson, but elephants aren't horses. But just to give you an idea of the counting coup, he said, one time he said a Viet Cong soldier came running right past him, and he said, and I just stepped out from behind a tree and I grabbed him, and I took his rifle, so I got his gun and I got him, and then I said in Vietnamese, run. And so he ran. And my buddies watched that, and he says, what in the hell are you doing? Why didn't you kill him? He said, I know why I did it. I had my reasons. The important thing is you saw me do it. And so that's how this was all about. And so the stories are just remarkable. And here he is demonstrating one of his fights against the Viet Cong with girls dressed as warriors. Then Desert Storm. As Larry said, I wrote the biography of Ben Nighthorse Campbell. He's Cheyenne, and so I happened to be with him on the reservation when Ron Bigback came back from Desert Storm. And Ron had come back with a complete Iraqi uniform, and the family was going to honor him by welcoming him home. And when he was over there, he had written a letter to his father and said, Dad, he said, I had this very strange dream that I was on a beautiful war pony, and the pony was crossing a stream, but snakes kept coming out of the water and biting the horse. And he said the horse was a strong horse, and it carried me to the other side and then died. But I made it. And he said, what do you think that dream means? And so on the res, there was a fellow named Tom Rockroads, who was a Korean War veteran, but a spiritual leader. And Father talked to him, and he says, he needs a cleansing ceremony when he gets home because evil spirits have really attacked him. And so this was then going to be part of that cleansing ceremony and also an honor ceremony. Here's the Iraqi uniform that he had brought back. And Rockroads is the fellow with the sage around him, and he's explaining to the group now, there are about 100 family people there at the home, saying that he was going to have a cleansing ceremony, and then Tom Bigback was going to get a new Indian name. And so then they had this very blessing ceremony, and you see a simulated scalp that was being used for the cleansing ceremony, but Tom Rockroads could do it because he actually had taken some scalps in Korea, and so he was entitled to conduct that ceremony. And then after the ceremony was over, they counted coup on the Iraqi uniform. Everybody there got a stick, and as they played the drum, everybody went around and counted coup on that Iraqi. Anyhow, it was really quite a moving moment, and thunder and lightning was coming down as this was going on. And then Campbell had to go to a meeting across the res, and I went with him, and we were at this old lady's house, and I said, oh, you missed the ceremony there, the honoring ceremony, the naming ceremony. Tom Rockroads became Charging Eagle. And this old lady says, yes, she said, I'm sorry I missed it, but she said, you should have been here after World War II. We had so many of those ceremonies, and you should have seen all those old ladies dancing with those German and Japanese scalps. So anyhow, the traditions are trying to continue. And then we have Iraq, Afghanistan, and so anyhow, this is Chuck Bowers, the fellow on the left who was a combat photographer. And so this picture actually ended up on the cover of Indian Country Today, but he's there with one of his Indian buddies. And so he's got an amazing story. He just got discharged. He got injured in Iraq, and he's got some post-traumatic stress syndrome problems. But anyhow, while he was over in Iraq, he said, I got this flyer that there was going to be a powwow in Fallujah in a war zone. This is in 2005, I think it was. And so the woman sitting there with the beautiful pink dress on, Deborah Mooney, Sergeant from National Guard, Oklahoma, she got the idea of having a powwow for the Indian soldiers who were over in Iraq. And her commanding officer said, anything for boost morale, go ahead and do it. Said, as long as it doesn't cost us anything. And she said, it didn't cost them anything. We had to make a few things, and we were only supposed to use equipment that was already dysfunctional. And I can guarantee when we were done with what we made, it was dysfunctional. And so anyhow, they made a drum out of an oil drum and canvas from a cot. And family members from home sent them material to make ribbon shirts and things. So here are the soldiers with their drum. And a lot, of course, non-Indians watched, participated, and got a taste of Indian country in Iraq. And this was in a combat zone, and Chuck Bowers said, I got that flyer, and I was entitled to a 3-day pass, and I asked my commanding officer, can I go over there to that powwow? And he said, sure, go ahead. He said, I get in this convoy, and as we're going to the powwow, we come under attack, this convoy. He said, I'm ducking rocket-propelled grenades and machine gun bullets. And I was saying to myself, what in the world would possess me to go cross-country to a powwow, but he did it, and he took all these pictures then. And one of the girls then got a shawl from home because it was a shawl in honor of one of the soldiers from that unit that had gotten killed. And so then she wore that at one of the dances. And then there's Brett Lindstrom, who was killed in Iraq. And this is how Indians do honor their veterans. This boy had never lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation, but his family was from Pine Ridge. And so when he was killed, the people at Pine Ridge asked if the boy could be brought there to be honored. And so a huge crowd of people met the Marine ambulance at the reservation line, and they put him then in this buckboard, and they just marched with him all the way to Kyle to put him into in repose in the gymnasium, his high school gymnasium, or their high school gymnasium. The Marine Guard stood there for 24 hours. And then he was given an Indian name, and his uncle said he had to have an Indian name because, and he got an Indian name called, Lone Eagle, that he said without an Indian name, when he goes to the afterlife, the Great Spirit won't know he's an Indian, and so he has to have a name. And of course, you have one of your own local heroes here, Nathan Goodiron, and he's honored on your memorial here by Frame Barracks. And so he got killed by a rocket-propelled grenade in 2006. So there are Indian veterans to this day going out, fighting, and of course now we have women soldiers. And this is Micah Ray Highwalking, Northern Cheyenne. And I had her pose in front of Custer's Monument at West Point. And so I asked her, I said, well, what do you think about being at West Point? And she said, Herman, she said, it's creepy. I'm there in the same barracks that Custer lived in. I eat in the same mess hall. And here I am. He tried to wipe us out. And now I'm here to be an officer. In fact, she's graduated now and she's over in Afghanistan. But she said, I look at myself as a warrior, doing what's good for my people, representing my people, and that's all that counts. He said, in helping my country. And then we'll kind of conclude with this to show you how things really have changed. Here's an all-female honor guard, active duty soldiers, how things have changed. And so 2 are Crows, one's a Cheyenne, and one's a Navajo. And so that concludes Warriors in Uniform. Okay, thank you very much.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Excellent. Should we have a seat? Okay. What we'd like to do now, I think this is just a fascinating setup for what our title was today, is to talk about changing interpretations. And so I found this just fascinating and what remarkable photographs. But what I'd like to do before we launch into a conversation now with Herman about changing interpretations of history, of Native history and of Western history, is to find out if there's any folks that would like to ask some questions of Herman about what he just talked about and about the warriors in uniform. And I think we've got a microphone. Robin is very dutifully up there with a microphone. If anybody has any questions about this. We have a question over here, Robin. We got a microphone coming. If we can just hold on for just a second, please.
Would it be fair to refer to those Sioux who have been in the military as fighting Sioux?
I would say it's fair to call them fighting Sioux. Well done. I only have got an inkling of what's going on out here, but I saw the paper a couple days ago where it said something about a lawsuit, and I don't think I want to get my feet in that water. But, let's face it, Indians are very proud of their warrior tradition. And I went to a college, Marquette, that had, the Marquette Warriors. But the problem with that is that you often have these stereotypical clowns that act like silly Indians and stuff, and, that really embarrasses. But I remember one time I attended a class, a workshop put on by Indians, and the speaker said, all these universities, all these colleges, want to use us for their heroes. And he said, we ought to respect that, but just, let's make sure that no lines are crossed about how we're treated and how we are honored, because we are warriors and we want to keep that warrior tradition.
Are there any serious questions? Phil, thanks for being here, Phil.
Just stretch over you.
Can we bring up the audience light just a little bit, please?
In the 1920s, Congress enacted legislation that recognized American Indians, or we can say Native Americans, as citizens. But what I had heard was there was no intent to do that until the Indian World War I veterans came out, and they would not be eligible for veterans benefits, and it was a dilemma that had to be resolved. In your research, have you come across anything toward that effect regarding World War I veterans benefits, and the American Indian Citizenship Act?
Right, I think that's quite correct, because as I mentioned, thousands and thousands of Indians enlisted in World War I. 3 tribes actually declared war on the Germans. The Passamaquoddies they sent 500 of their people. They're one of the smallest tribes in America, and they also sent their chief over. And so you suddenly had a dilemma with, the need to make sure that Indians got their benefits. But of course, you got to also remember that the way it worked in this country, if an Indian went in the military, that automatically gave that person citizenship. And so that went on even in the 19th century. But, the turn of the 20th century, things really changed dramatically. But there was no doubt that Indians suddenly became on the mainstream as far as publicity. The Germans were terrified of Indians, and that's why they did quite well in combat, and they really made a mark over there.
There's a question on this side, Robin. We have to do this to Robin, where the questions go like this.
Yeah, back and forth. That's like a ping pong match here.
Up at the 3 affiliated tribes reservation, there's a scout cemetery for scouts who were connected with the U.S. military in North Dakota and I think in the region. Is it typical that there's a separate scout cemetery, or have many of these scouts been buried in U.S. military cemeteries across the country?
Well, that's a toughie. as I mentioned, like that fellow from Iowa wasn't even allowed to be buried in his hometown. So I think it varies from region to region, but I would say that quite often they're not, until recent, let's say modern times, they're in segregated cemeteries, I would say. That's my experience.
Susan, as long as you stood up, this is Susan Weefald, and she's written a book about hiking in North Dakota. I must admit I haven't read your book yet, but do you talk about going in, like, to any of the cemeteries? Are there any hikes to those locations? No. Okay. All right. Well, I thought I'd try. Any other questions? Okay. What we'd like to do now is have a discussion about the changing interpretations of history relative to Native American history and to Western history, and I think we can get into a pretty good discussion about that. But before we do, what I'd like to do is invite Clay Jenkinson to make any comments about your presentation and how it fits into our changing interpretations. And
well, I have no comment. I thought it was just marvelous in those stories. But let me ask a question that comes out of that and goes back to the question of fighting Sioux, which I think it was actually a serious question behind a frivolous one. But, you know, you talk about warriors, and you delicately, carefully talked about taking scalps and so on. Talk about the two cultures and how they have to negotiate carefully when they talk about things like this, because if you were talking about non-Indian soldiers coming back with body parts and trophies, it would be a very different sort of subject from this. So can you talk a little bit about how a historian, in your case a non-native historian, looks at the two cultures and negotiates these important cultural differences in a way that's fair to everybody?
That's really a very difficult question. The reality is that when the Indians did things like that, it was for honor purposes. And frankly, the way I even got an inkling of that is when I first came to the Smithsonian in 1972. A fellow named Wolfrobe Hunt, who was a jeweler in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was dying of diabetes. And his father had been an informant to the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology in the 20s. And Wolfrobe had the last sacred songs and drawings. He was the last one to be the person who had those stories and songs. And he wanted them preserved for posterity because he said, you know, the kids nowadays on the reservations, they're watching television. And they don't have an appreciation for the traditions of our people. So the Smithsonian sent me out there, and my wife Susan came along, my kids. We spent about a week and a half there. I ended up in the hospital getting shots because he had cats, and I'm deathly allergic to cats. But I was sitting there with him every day recording these songs and recording the drawings that he would make. And he was the last of the Delight Makers, which was one of those kachinas. And so he would sing these different songs for me. The Eagle song, the creation song. And then one day he said, well, Herman, I guess I better sing you the Acoma scalp song. And of course, my feeling was Pueblo Indians never did scalping. And I said, a scalp song, Wolfrobe? You have a scalp song in the Acoma tradition? He said, yes. He said, we are warriors. We have been warriors since long before you guys showed up. And so I said, oh, okay. So when was the last time the Acomas took a scalp? Well, he said, let me think. He said, well, I know for sure it was my uncle in World War II. And he said he was in the street fighting, the end of the war, and he was, going along the street. He got shot. He was lying in a gutter, and he's unconscious, semi-conscious, and he said 3 German soldiers came along, and one kicked him to make sure he was dead. And that woke him up. And he said, as those soldiers walked away from him, he rolled over and flipped a hand grenade at him and killed all 3, but he scalped the one who kicked him. And he said, So he kept that scalp the rest of his life. And he said, but he said, taking a scalp is serious business because that spirit is always going to be following you because you go to the hereafter as a whole person. And so my uncle always had to feed it cornmeal and take care of it and honor it. And that was kind of that tradition. And so that's where a lot of this comes from. It's the tradition. You are carrying on your tribal tradition. Now, let's face it, not all tribes scalp. Some tribes thought it was barbaric. But certain tribes did have that as a tradition, and that's why they will try to continue doing it in the military. And of course, the Army doesn't want to talk about it, but it does occur.
The Geneva Convention would have a decided opinion on this.
Oh, absolutely.
Are there any, did you run across any evidence of Native soldiers being punished by the military for carrying out what to them is an honor ceremony with an enemy?
Well, yes, I have, and I already told you that, but anyhow, I'll tell it again, I guess. Because when I started working on this book, the word kind of went around Indian country that I was working on a book like this, and so a number of Indian people got in touch with me and, wanted to be part of this and to share their experiences. And one fellow called me, and he had been in Desert Storm, and so we talked for quite a while. And so I said, did you do any warrior deeds? And he said, yes. He said, I did. He said, first of all, you got to realize in Desert Storm, it was not a very honorable war because the airplanes did most of the damage. They killed the soldiers before we got to them. But he said, I would cut ears from a dead soldier. And but he said, I got caught. And he said, I got court-martialed for it. So I said, can I put that in the book? He said, no. He said, I want to put that behind me. I don't want any publicity about that sort of thing. But it's the sort of thing that went on and probably still goes on. Yes?
My father was a platoon leader in
We get
World War II.
Could we get a microphone? We're going to have to get a microphone because the people at home can't hear you. So
Oh, okay.
So just hold on.
Oh,
no, it's going to be worth it.
I'm going to move this up.
It's going to be worth it. Robin? Yeah, could we get the microphone up here, please? Yeah, thank you very much. There's a question right down front here.
My dad was a platoon leader in World War II, and he had Navajo code talkers. It was communications. And they used those field telephones. He has stories to tell about that, too, and how you couldn't understand anything over the field telephones, let alone Navajo. But he did have some soldiers that did take scalps in World War II, and he talked to them about that before they went on board ship. He was in the Marine Corps, and so they had to have an inspection of their sea bags. And anyway, my dad got in trouble for the scalps that they took. So, he I don't know exactly what happened, but he mentioned that as he told them to put them at the bottom of the sea bags, not at the top. So.
I'm going to ask a question to both of you, and I'd like both of you to respond to this. Does it make a difference if Larry Scogan, Norwegian from Hettinger, takes a scalp or cuts an ear off of a dead enemy, or if Phil Baird from Standing Rock does it? Is there a difference, and do you think we should see it as different?
Well, I would see it as entirely different. I would say you're trying to pretend to be something you're not, and you're kind of dishonoring a very honorable tradition.
It comes from the larger problem of cultural appropriation, and if you've been following the endless Fighting Sioux controversy, it's about cultural appropriation in part. Under what circumstances does culture A have the right to borrow or appropriate iconography, terminology, etc., from a culture that it's not? And in the course of American history, non-native cultures have freely appropriated that which they have chosen to appropriate almost from the beginning. But with the cultural revolution that you're a part of, and I'm hoping we'll talk more about that, there's greater sensitivity to under what circumstances a non-native culture can borrow traditions from native culture. And that's really the philosophical background to the Fighting Sioux controversy, whatever it may seem in terms of athletics and nicknames. And so for you to go off to Vietnam and take a scalp would be not only culturally inappropriate, but it would be obscene because your culture has not created the tradition under which that's understood and contextualized and part of a larger respect tradition and so on. And that's what you're saying.
That's exactly right, yes.
You have to earn it, and you earn it by being an authentic member of that culture. But even then, you haven't earned it. I mean, these individuals go through elaborate preparatory activities, and this is not what you see in a John Wayne film of taking a scalp as an act of torture. It's a much more complex act than
Oh,
that.
absolutely. And of course, you got to realize, too, this when you start talking about scalping, you're not talking about something really gruesome. The scalps were about the size of a quarter. And, you know, it's just that the symbolism, it's just like, in some senses, it's like the pilots who would paint an insignia on an airplane when they shot the other airplane down. So this is proof that you were in combat, that you had acted honorably, you met the enemy, and you conquered the enemy. Carson Walks Over Ice, in fact, took 20 scalps in that one engagement where I told you about the machine gunners. And but he didn't get to come home with them because he was airborne, and he got shot coming down, hit with a machine gun bullet. And so when he woke up, you know, he was in a field hospital and everything had been taken away. But just to give you an idea how the spiritual life of these reservations and the communities that are still there, I mentioned his safe return was predicted in the Sundance. And so anyhow, they did a Sundance. One of his relatives was in the Sundance, praying for his safe return from Vietnam. And when he went through the 4 days, and it was at the end, just as about the Sundance was about to end, you know, the Sundance door is facing to the east, and he said as he woke up, there was Carson standing in the doorway in his uniform with a cane. And that's exactly the way Carson showed up on the reservation a couple years later. He spent some time in the Philippines getting recovered from that wound, but everybody on that reservation knew that story, and they told me about it. And so that's how this spiritual life is continued. And just what you say, you don't go in just haphazardly and say, I'll do this. You are prepared. You're taught by your relatives, your grandparents, your parents, and then you just are following the moccasin trail that gets you to where you are today.
Well, let me ask you a different sort of question, and I hope you're willing to reflect on your own life and career, but when you started out a number of decades ago, Western history was in a certain sort of a place, and now the history of the American West is in another phase, and you've lived through that, and as you know, that change from a mostly Eurocentric white guys are good and everyone else is either a bit player or an enemy, that paradigm, which you probably grew up under, is no longer the dominant way of seeing Western history. But it hasn't come as an effortless transition. It's been a series of debates and quarrels and lots of hand-wringing and so on. Talk a little bit about your own story and the change in the way we see these things.
Well, I've always been interested in Western history. The truth is, my parents are from Italy, and I learned a lot just by going to Western movies as a kid. My parents would go to the theater across the street, the Tom Mix movies, and they would learn English, and I got imprinted by cowboys and Indians. So all my life I was fascinated by it. I read everything I could. But, you know, when I got my formal education then, you know, just as Clay says, the way we were taught was a thing called the Turner thesis, which is that the frontier went west to a certain point. Then about 1890, there was no frontier. And the frontier was this very nice progression of immigrants, mostly, you know, Scandinavian people, white folks going in the wagon trains. And as they went west, Sometimes the Indians tried to interrupt, but for the most part, the Indians just went their separate ways, and it was a very nice settlement to the west, manifest destiny. And that's the way I was raised, and that's the way the school books were. And you would almost be sacrilegious to think there was another story there. And so it's only after I got involved with basic research and started seeing that there were these different stories. The frontier didn't go east to west like we thought. Part of it did, but there was a frontier that came from the south. The Spanish, the Mexicans came up into the Americas. And then you also had the Russians coming in, and you had the Asians coming in. And suddenly you realize then that there are no real simple explanations for what happened out here. But there were a few people that gave up that theory kicking and screaming. And so there were some very bitter disputes at historical conventions when you had someone like, say, Patty Limerick say, you know, you guys have got it all wrong. This is what really happened. And, oh, no, that's, you know, you're just talking about a minor episode, but the real story is all those people came from the Atlantic Ocean and going to the west. So that's, you're right, the West has been, the interpretation of the West has changed dramatically. But for me, the key part is the fact that the Indians suddenly became human beings, you know, not something mysterious. And I really got focused on that when they mentioned this book, Thomas McKenney, that I wrote. Well, I wrote the biography of the man who started the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so this was 1824, and he was a Quaker, and he believed that within one generation, Indians would disappear if you gave them an education. So he started the first school program for Indians in the United States. But what he did then, when these Indians came to Washington, D.C. to meet the president, he hired an artist to paint their portraits, because we wouldn't want to know what Indians looked like, you know, 200 years later. And, but then the point was that suddenly these Indians had faces and names. And until that point, really, you had generic pictures of Indians, but you seldom had a name associated. It was like they were trees in the forest, but not, you know, this is your pine tree, this is your birch tree. And so suddenly there was this recognition that Indians were humans and they were like us. You know, my favorite story is with the Lewis and Clark expedition, where Sacagawea meets Kameawat out there. And, you know, suddenly they realize that they're related, and they start hugging and crying and kissing. And both Lewis and Clark wrote in their journals, this was so fascinating to see that Indians had the same feelings like white people have. You know, that says a lot about where we were 100 and 150 years ago and today.
But when, in your own case, when this sort of, let's call it cultural revolution came along in the late 60s and things began to change and all these, I mean, these disputes were not just polite conversations.
Oh,
these were shunning and ostracism and shouting matches and people not being invited to national meetings. And I mean, there was a huge amount of acrimony in this change.
Considerable.
Where were you? How did you, did you just seamlessly move into a much more generous worldview, or were you always that way waiting for this revolution to happen?
I'm not a radical. I would just say, well, it's amusing, you guys fight it out, and I'm just going to do my thing. And that's basically what I did. Even when I started that training program for Indians at the Smithsonian, and I shouldn't put this on record, but, you know, I ran into considerable resentment. I won't mention the name, but one of the senior curators there one time, who worked closely with Indian people his whole career, and he stopped me in the hallway and he said, Herman, do you really think you're going to turn Indians into historians and librarians and archivists? And I said, yes. I said, absolutely. I said, all they need is the exposure to this and the opportunity, and it'll happen. And he said, boy, am I glad I'm at the end of my career, he said, because I wouldn't want to see that. And that's kind of what you ran into. Even at a place like the Smithsonian, there are these people that are so ingrained with their theories, and even just look at what the black community today, look at the struggles they're having. You would think, color is, we should be colorblind, but we aren't, and a reality in our society.
This book that you've been speaking about today, I mean, there's a kind of a truism in history that the lens you wear determines the thing that you see. And I think I've heard you say you could not have written this book 30 years ago. What's changed that, I mean, how did you decide to put this lens on to look at Native American participation in our wars?
Well, there are a couple parts of that. First of all, 30, 40 years ago, Indians wouldn't have told me these stories. There's let's face it, there's a basic distrust a lot of times with the different cultures. And even with this work I've done, I spent a lot of time going back and forth in Indian country because of that program I started. But you don't walk up to an Indian family and say, tell me Grandpa's stories. They want to know who you are and can they trust you. And you might be talking with someone 5 different times over 10 years, and they say, oh, by the way, you asked me once about such and such, and I'll tell you. And that's how it is. So I think we've come a long way in bringing the cultures together. I think the Museum of the American Indian has been extremely important for that. That's the idea that now there's a museum on the mall closest to the Capitol building for American Indians. And I can't tell you how proud Indian people are when they talk to me and say, we're there now, we belong here. And so that is helping to break down these barriers. And so 30 years ago, I know, I could never, you might have told me the story, but I could never have published it. But now I can. And now they'll tell me, they'll call me and say, you forgot this or this. And so that's what's happened. Our society, in a lot of ways, is coming closer together. First of all, let's face it, a lot of Indians aren't living on reservations anymore. They're living next door to us in these towns. And so there is a blending of cultures. And I think one of our real challenges today is to help ensure that Indian people's traditions survive, their songs survive, their languages survive. Bilingual programs are extremely important because without those languages, so much that's American Indian is going to be gone. And I've experienced this myself with different Indian communities, and it's really like a light switch will go off because there are certain stories, certain words that just don't exist with one language to the other, and it's not an easy transition.
As long as we're talking about changing interpretations, I'd like to ask you to respond to this. You talked about the the Museum of American Indians that now the Smithsonian has, but you were in Indian history for many, many years, and you were inside the Museum of Natural History.
Right.
And I think there's a huge interpretation shift there.
Absolutely, because Indians at the Smithsonian, Indians were in the Museum of Natural History, which is the deer and the moose and the elk, and that's where we had the story of Indians. And that is, psychologically very difficult. And that's why I think the transition of now they have their own museum, and now next we're going to have the African Museum. But, they deserve their story to be told as kind of a greater story instead of being part of the wildlife or the environment. And that just shows you how we have come a long way, but that Museum of Natural History was built, in 1910 or so, and that's what they were thinking in those days.
Do you think in part, Herman, that was a result of a shift in the idea of the vanishing race to the resilience of Indian people?
I would say that's certainly partially true, because by 1900, we always have that cliche, the vanishing red man. And in a sense, they vanished, but only because they were put on reservations and no one went to visit them. And they didn't, but the population did dip pretty severely around 1900, 1910. And they didn't have, press agents, and they didn't have the kind of, ability to make a statement, because they didn't have status, they didn't have money, they didn't have allies. There weren't many scholars working with Indian people back then. We'd gone through some difficult periods, late 19th century, and a lot of people just wanted to, know that Indians were out of sight and out of mind. And that was what happened for quite a while until World War I. I think World War I was really a breakthrough, because suddenly people that we didn't even know existed suddenly popped up and said, we're fighting for our country. And thousands of them enlisted. And they weren't citizens. And they had war bond drives, and they did all kinds of stuff like that they had frankly no reason to do, because they had been so mistreated. This was the heart of the period of trying to take Indianness out of Indians, put them in these boarding schools, eradicate their traditions and beliefs, turn them into farmers, which was a nonsense for a lot of those people.
Let me ask you about John Wesley Powell for a moment. I know he's one of your favorites. Extraordinarily important man in the history of the American West. I think his dates are 1834 to 1902, but he was the creator of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology, and you have a lot of tradition with that.
Well, yeah, I ran his archives for 20 years. And so what he believed that Indians were going to disappear, but he wanted to make sure that we collected their languages before they were gone. And so he made it a calculated effort to record Indian languages. And so we had at the archives about 200 or so linguistic books and programs like that. So he really did a lot to, ironically, help now, because there's a big restoration effort to try to get these languages back. But it's really a tough uphill fight. I remember one time I was there, these 4 Quapaw ladies came from Oklahoma. And they talked to me and they said, we want to restore the Quapaw language. And we're the last speakers of the language. And we aren't really perfect speakers either. So what do you have in your archives of our languages? And so, I pulled out all these recordings, and these were not oral recordings, they were like transcripts of things. But it's hopeless when you have only 4 or 5 people that know the language partially. There was no way they were going to restore that language, but it shows the effort that was being tried. And other tribes now are still in pretty good shape. And so that's why they are putting serious money into these efforts to pay the elders to come and teach in the schools and keep those languages alive. But John Wesley Powell was extremely important for that. But I'll tell you, want to hear a kind of an offbeat John Wesley Powell story then? This is very offbeat. And John Wesley Powell had a super ego. And he had his assistant that had worked with him for years and years. And this guy had a pretty good ego too. I think his name was McClellan. And so anyhow, they joked about each other about who was the smarter of the two. And it got more and more serious as time went on. And they said, who's got the better brain? I've got the better brain. You got the better. No, I'm the best brain here. And so finally said, the only one way we're ever going to know for sure is that after we're dead, our brains ought to be weighed and measured. And so they put into their wills that their brains would then be taken out and examined and measured and weighed. And so anyhow, back in the 70s when I was there, we dedicated a new library at the Museum of Natural History, and we called it the John Wesley Powell Library. And one of the curators said, it's really not right to have a party for someone and not bring the guest of honor. So he then excused himself and went into the storage area and came out with his glass jar, and it was John Wesley Powell's brain, nicely identified. And just for the record, Powell's brain was about 2 grams lighter than his associate. But physicians have informed me that the weight of the brain is not the measure of the intelligence. So we'll never know who was the smarter. But when you want to talk about things at the Smithsonian, you'd be amazed what's in those, behind those locked doors.
I'm sure we should get to some audience questions, but let me ask you a question about Lewis and Clark. In Diplomats in Buckskins, you talk about these native peoples who would be drawn for one reason or another to go see the Great Father in Washington and the rituals that unfolded there. And I think there were three delegations that wound up coming out of the Lewis and Clark expedition. One from North Dakota, Sheheke, with a big white,
Right.
and he went to Washington, and getting him home was a very difficult thing, and in fact it led indirectly to the death of Meriwether Lewis, or contributed to it. But the man from the North Dakota-South Dakota border, Eagle Feather or Arkita and Arshar, the Arikara, went in 1805, and he never came back, and he died in Washington, D.C. Can you just talk a little bit about these early delegations and how some of them miscarried and what their purposes were?
Well, the delegation story goes right back to the beginning of our country, and in fact, the British and the French took Indians overseas. Columbus, in fact, brought the first Indians overseas after he came to the Americas. And so the whole idea was to get Indian loyalty. And so as our country was being developed, they felt that it was wise psychologically to bring Indian leaders to D.C. To wow them with the strength of the U.S. government, the numbers of white people, and so that was just very calculated policy. And the delegations, though, took a real risk. An amazing number of those Indians who came on these delegations died, either en route to Washington, in Washington, or on the way home. And what they died from were the diseases that they were exposed to. Measles killed a lot of Indians. Whooping cough, things like that. They just had no exposure to those things. And so, as I said, Congressional Cemetery has about 30 of these leaders buried there. And you'd be amazed that to this day, the feelings in some of these Indian communities about the chiefs who died in Washington, because they think that the government deliberately killed their chiefs when they wouldn't sign a treaty. The Nez Perce, for example, I spent a lot of time out there because of the Lewis and Clark project. And one of their leaders came in the 1860s, and he died and was buried in D.C. And the people, their oral tradition says he did not want to sign that treaty, and so the government killed him. And that's hard to eradicate, that kind of thinking. And the Indians themselves were just simply overwhelmed by this coming into the East, because they had no experience. When they went home, they would say there are more white people than there are sands on the beaches. But my favorite story is with the Red Cloud delegation that came after Fetterman's last stand. What the government would do is, the delegations were often quite large, 15 or 20 people. Sometimes a couple of women would be along because they wanted the women to meet the Washington women, and they'd learn about knitting and going to school and child care. They were never really part of the official negotiations. And so, but out west, those white folks, there must have been some pretty serious politicians, but they resented the fact that Indians were being taken east, all expenses paid, and there was a lot of anger at that. Why are we wasting money on these people, wining and dining them? And so they would sometimes put the delegations in their own private railroad car so they could be better protected as they went through, let's say, Laramie or some of these frontier towns. But then as they the trains usually came through Chicago. There was one route, transcontinental Chicago, then Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. And so the word would get out that these train was coming, and going to these famous chiefs. And of course, Red Cloud was very famous at the time. And the newspapers announced, train carrying Red Cloud is going to be at our station, at such and such a time. And there would be literally hundreds of people on the platforms wanting to see these chiefs. And these Indians were just boggled at the thought of all these people. And one of the interpreters recorded them. He said these Indians were amazed at all these different people showing up at the train stations. How could there be that many white people in the world? And then they finally decided, no, we are seeing the same white people at every train station. And that white people with their superior technology could move cities like the Plains Indians could move their teepee villages. And that was it. That was all. So we're just seeing the same folks. You've seen one white man, you've seen them all, you know. So, so it really was an amazing kind of a set of circumstances, but fascinating stories.
What led you to write that book?
Because when I told you I started the biography of Thomas McKenney, who started the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he was responsible for taking care of Indian delegations. That was really the beginning of the official government program. And as I wrote that biography, I just saw these fascinating stories that no one had ever recorded. Now, and to be honest, I started my career at the National Archives with the records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And if you want to write Indian history, it's the National Archives. The government in about the 1930s because paper takes up a lot of space. And this is really hard to believe, but the National Archives destroyed all of the financial records from the 19th century because who was going to be interested in how much it cost to sue such and such in the Civil War. But they kept the records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs financial records because there had been that Congress had passed an act that allowed Indians to sue the federal government for past injustices. And so they felt they couldn't destroy all that material because that's going to be used in lawsuits. So that's why if you're doing research on Indians, you can basically find out how much it costs to put the nails in an Indian coffin to this day in the 19th century because every penny spent is still there. And when I started doing this research, then I could see that, well, here's all the story about Indian delegations, how much they spent for the hotel room, the clothes they gave them, where they went, what theaters they went to. And it really opened up an amazing story. But, of course, there was a lot of fraud then that came out because white people involved were always milking the system. And one of my favorite ones is they would take Indians to see Mount Vernon when they got to D.C. And there's a boat you take even today. You can go to downtown, you go to Mount Vernon. And there were a couple of these delegations where the food bill was just outrageous for the food that was fed to those Indians on those boats. And one auditor said, it just shows you the bracing effects of a ride on the Potomac that built a real appetite for those Indians. But of course, it was that the guys were just charging them for 5 sandwiches per Indian when they only had 1, you know. But it's that kind of fraud that was being done. In fact, one Indian agent had a farm outside of D.C., and so they'd take the Indians to the stores to buy new clothes because they felt the Indians should look like white people if they're meeting the president, and they'd get suits and things. But this one Indian agent, he would just buy a whole bunch of clothes and take them out to his farm. And one of the guys said, "Where's the Indian agent today?" He said, "Oh, he's gone with another load to his farm." So there were just thousands and thousands of dollars taken away by these corrupt individuals. But it's a fascinating story.
Larry, this is where you come in because...
Talking about corruption and
I told you.
Corruption?
No, not corruption. But you had the honor of working with Dr. Viola, and you wrote your dissertation about claims. Talk a little bit about your relationship.
Oh, well, that one's easy.
Hate to wake you up here, Larry.
Startled me. I was sound asleep. No, I was fascinated with what Herman was saying, and I will talk a little bit about a relationship, but before I forget it, I want to ask a question. I want to get back to the changing interpretations. Okay. And most of the folks won't know this, but Dr. Viola studied under Francis Paul Pruka, a Jesuit priest, who is really the great father of great father histories. I think that goes without saying.
Absolutely.
He would certainly be more of a traditionalist, I think, in his interpretations, and maybe I'm wrong on that. So I'm curious, and I know that you continue to stay in close contact with him, and he's in his 90s now. But has he ever, as you've continued to write things that are the untold story, you know, the Diplomats in Buckskin, the untold story of Custer's Last Stand, Warriors in Uniform, has Father Pruka ever said, Herman?
Yeah, get real.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. How many of you have even ever heard of Father Pruka, Paul Pruka? Okay, good, some of you. Yes, he's really been an important part of my life. My second son is named for him, and we are still very close friends. And he's the one who gave me this assignment to do Thomas McKinney. I came out of the Navy. I shouldn't even say this, but anyway, I came out of the Navy, and I was an enlisted man, and I was going for my master's degree. And if you've ever gone to Catholic school, you know that there are these nuns that you have to compete against. And I'm hearing, just come out of the Navy, I got 3 or 4 nuns in the class, and there were only about a dozen students. And Father says, the first thing you're going to have to do is write a term paper for me, and I'm assigning the topic. And everybody else got what I thought was, cream puffs. Andrew Jackson, Thomas Hart Benton, John C. Calhoun. And then he said, and you get Thomas McKinney. I had never heard of Thomas McKinney. And I even went home and said, he just is trying to flunk me out of this program before I even get started. And it turned out, though, that he had written this book on Indian policy, and he had been criticized for his interpretation of McKinney. And he wanted someone to do research on him to verify his interpretation, which I did verify. And so what I can tell is, some of you are school teachers here, how important that I get asked to speak at high schools a lot, how important it is to do your homework and take it seriously. He gave me that term paper topic, and that became my master's thesis then under him. It then became my doctoral dissertation topic. It became my first book and led to my next 2 books, all because of one school assignment. So that's something you can't say often. But anyhow, while he is the foremost authority on American Indian policy, the policy of the government towards Indians, he'd hardly ever met an Indian in his life. And in fact, years later, doing my research, I went to Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There was a Jesuit community there, and one of the Jesuits was one of my high school teachers. And we spent an evening discussing the problem. He said, there's Father Pruka writing about Indians and doesn't have a clue what Indians are really like, and has had such an impact, and he should spend some time with us out here. And that's quite the truth. And so Father finally accepted, since I wasn't kicked out of the Smithsonian, the fact that my stuff might have some merit, because I was working a lot with oral history, collecting information from people that are not the traditional ways scholars work. But what I would try to do is, when I got oral history, I would then try to go to the National Archives and look at the official records and match them up. And that's when I discovered that Indian oral history often is extremely accurate. And so it's really quite valuable, and that's why it's so important for us to save as much of it as we can to this day. I gave any advice for the state of North Dakota, you got a little oil money, why don't you send some people out there to start recording some of these things, because we're in the last generation of people that can carry on some of these stories, traditions, beliefs, and 100 years from now they're going to be extremely important.
So Larry.
Okay, so now I'll answer the question Clay asked. To start off, just so folks know, Herman mentioned earlier, we've known each other for 25 years. Went like that. It's hard to believe. Herman, at that time, was taught almost every summer, I think, out at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. And if you've never visited that, I certainly recommend it. And I was on the faculty at the Air Force Academy. And so I got a small stipend from the history department there to go up and take a class from Herman, and that's how we met. And he's been very supportive of me since then. A few years later, I think he would have had veto power over my PhD program. The Air Force Academy called Herman to find out if I had the right stuff to be sent off for a PhD, and thankfully he didn't veto it, so thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we've stayed in touch over the years. And I guess most importantly, into the question that Clay has raised, is that Herman was very important, as was Father, who let me call him a number of times. And I got to do my research in the very records that Herman's been talking about. It is amazing that you can sit and look at the records. And they have these big books. If you remember cartoons, they open the big books. The treasury books are huge books. And you fold those or open those books up, and you can go right down, and it tells you how much money was spent on beef, on blankets, on beads, on pots and pans and education. It's amazing the detail of these. So as I tried to sort through these, I often called Herman or Father Pruka to help me interpret these things, because they're very difficult and they're very complex to interpret. So that goes back a long ways, but
Sure does.
it's been a
The
very...
records are fabulous. Anybody here looking for a dissertation topic, if you like Indians, this is something that you can really still get access to. It's all there in Washington, D.C.
Questions?
Certainly. Okay, if Robin's got the microphone, we'll certainly like to open it up to any questions that anybody has for either Clay Jenkinson or Dr. Viola.
Not for me.
I work for the state of North Dakota, and I have done some work with tribal consultation. A big issue that we've come across is intellectual property rights. A lot of people don't want to open up about their histories, about their tribes, and I'm wondering, what have you experienced about that intellectual property rights in writing this book? Has there been a backlash against you or any of the people who have spoken out about their stories?
I've not had any backlash that I'm aware of. But of course, with Indian people, they own their stories, for example. And so let's say you can't give Grandpa's story without the family saying yes and do it. And also, you have to give a gift or several gifts. So with almost every story I've gotten, we've had an exchange of, I give them some of my books I've done, I give them some tobacco, I give them some cash, and then it's their property and they're allowing me to use it. And I've not had my own experience, but I know what you're talking about. There is a belief, and that's why I was saying, you just don't walk in and try to get information, and they're not going to do it overnight. It's, I spend a lot, I've been adopted into the Crow tribe, for example, but the Cheyennes are their next door neighbors, but I did Campbell's biographies, and I got a lot of Cheyenne friends. But, I'll show up on the Cheyenne reservation, and one fellow said to me one time, says, "Well, Herman, are all your Crow friends busy today?" And so, there is that kind of sense of, who are you really friends with, and what are your motives?
Scott Davis, our Director of Indian Affairs here in the state of North Dakota. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Thank you. Herman, first of all, I want to thank you and obviously Larry and Clay again for your courage here today, and the previous sessions you've done on behalf of our people. It takes a lot of courage for you folks to come up and speak on some really touchy issues in our history. And it reminds me of one of my mentors, one of my heroes, another warrior in uniform is Gerard Baker. And,
yes.
His experience in interpretation, history, and trying to change that perception, in mainstream America, in the state of Montana, South Dakota, Battle of Lieberhorn, and also Mount Rushmore. But, talking with him, I never knew that he went through a lot of, hate mail, email, threats, the bureaucracy that was telling him, don't go down that path, don't write that story, don't say this, blah, blah, blah. In your experience, have you experienced that in some of your books or maybe in some of your, the work in D.C. and so forth, whether it may be, public hate mail or, powers that be above you telling you not to write or to publish certain things?
Well, it's interesting. I like Gerard. In fact, Gerard really did suffer a lot. He had to be removed from Little Bighorn because of the FBI thought he was going to get assassinated.
If I could interject here, for those that don't know, Gerard Baker, native Hidatsa, was superintendent at the Little Bighorn and at Mount Rushmore, works for the National Park Service.
But yes, you can't write a book without getting all kinds of emails and letters, and not all flattering. But the one project I did was for the Columbus Quincentenary, Seeds of Change. I did this big exhibit to really talk about what happened to the world after Columbus came to America and how our world today is just so impacted by that. You know, he brought the horse to America, and he brought disease, but he got corn and potatoes from the Indians. And so this exhibit was a major exhibit, and the USIA did a panel show that went around the world in like 4 languages, and we published the book, Seeds of Change, and it was the best-selling book in the history of the Smithsonian. We sold like 250,000 copies. But on the cover, I put this picture. Oh, you have it?
Go ahead.
So on the cover, I put this picture of Nigerians in a cornfield. This is the book. And so here you have these black faces, and they're in a cornfield. One of the Nigerians is wearing a baseball cap from the United States. And I said, this picture said everything you wanted to know about what Columbus meant to the world, because he came here, found corn. The Spanish didn't like corn. They thought it wasn't fit to eat, but they fed it to their animals. But they brought it to Africa, and it found a home in Africa and led to a population explosion in Africa. And so at the very time we were exporting or taking all these slaves out of Africa, the population there actually went up because of the foods from the American Indians that were brought there. And I said, look at that. This says it all. And immediately I started getting hate letters and irate phone calls. And the idea of putting black faces on a book about America and Columbus. People said they'd never give another nickel to the Smithsonian Institution. There was just horrendous stuff like that. But the truth is, it's the truth. And it was on the other hand, this book changed the way we teach American history now in the classroom, because we realize now that there really is a big story. For example, we always, we're raised about, we were talking about the traditional history going from, the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth Rock and the first Thanksgiving. Well, the first Thanksgiving was down there in, I think, Arizona, when the Spanish came up and met with some Indian people, and they had a big feast of Thanksgiving. But that's not in any of our textbooks. And so that's what this whole thing is about, the different groups of people that came and met and mingled and created the world we have today. And it all kind of starts with Columbus. But yes, I've had my share. And I've had my share, too, of things of being an Indian lover, let's be honest. You're watching the real problems of American history, the families who suffered a lot themselves through, in their family histories, Indians and white conflict. And they say, I'm overlooking some of the dark side, but I think you have to try to get both groups working together, and that's what I've been doing.
Questions? Dr. Wilson has a question. Oh, Doc, we got to get a microphone to you.
Sir, I was 44 years with the Fort Berthold people, and something I was just thinking of now, it puzzled me all those years, is why there's more patriotism among the Indian people for their soldiers and all than amongst the general population. Because it seems to me we should maybe learn something about their respect for government and their love of fighting for our survival and all that. Now, why is it that culture is different from ours, or can that be answered?
Oh, that's a tough one. Can you answer that one? You were in the military.
It's a tough one, but I do want to tell a quick story. When I was on the faculty at the Air Force Academy, I taught history of the American West, And I would always have, a lot of, as much as I could get in legitimately into the curriculum about Native American history. And I would always plan a field trip for my students, who were all Air Force cadets in uniform, and we'd load up a bus and I would take them to a powwow. And I remember the reaction I always got from them, because most of them would not be Native. And I remember particularly going up to Denver. They had a powwow, and I forget what they call it, the Urban Indian Center or something in Denver. And so we got off the bus and we filed in, and this entire auditorium had U.S. flags hanging from the ceiling all the way around. There were dozens of United States flags. They were all flags that were given to the families at the funerals for fallen veterans, U.S. flags. And it always got a response from the cadets. They could not believe this very same things you've been talking about, Herman. Well, but the Indians have always been our enemies. Why do we walk in here and see all these U.S. flags? And it would be a transformative moment for those cadets who are now going off to be officers in the United States military, to find out that the most patriotism they had seen at one location was an Indian powwow. It was an amazing moment, and I loved it every time I took them in there, because I knew they were going to get a real education. But I don't know how to answer the question. I think that the patriotism that we find within Native cultures, I think it's sort of in the DNA that we don't have in many of our own backgrounds, Norwegian or whatever. I don't know. I don't know if anybody has a good answer for that, but it's an astute observation for sure. Clay, do you want to add something to that?
No. Doesn't it go back to what you're talking about, the warrior culture, that patriotism and the warrior cultures are overlapping, but they're somewhat distinct too, and the one seems to bring about the other.
But the Indians have always told me, because I asked this question a lot, how can you be so patriotic when you really had kind of the dirty end of the stick so much of the time? And they all said to me, this is our country. We were here first. and we're going to be here if you white people ever leave. But this is our country. We love it, and we're going to protect it. And our tradition is to protect our family and our homes. And when our country is in trouble, then we take it as a personal problem. And I think that's what you have to accept it that way.
Another question over here.
I was going to say that I had an opportunity to hear Assistant Secretary Echo Hawk speak last summer, and that was the exact same answer he gave. He's a former Marine, talking about how Native Americans serve in greater proportion than their representation in our country. And that was the answer he gave. Well, this is our country, and of course we would step up and defend it. I just want to raise one issue here as we talk about, not to lose sight of something, a local take on this and a local issue. While Native Americans do serve in greater percentages than their representative in the population of the nation, here in North Dakota, in the North Dakota National Guard, we're starting to see some slipping numbers. I think Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're not seeing that here. And I think that given this history and the potential loss of culture, that we need to do a better job as a state in making sure that we're reaching out to the reservation youth here in North Dakota to ensure that those numbers in the National Guard remain strong and vibrant, because not only is it important to preserve the history, but of course when we see the census data that came out yesterday where here in North Dakota we have one of the 10 poorest counties in the nation, what a step up for what an opportunity for young Native men and women to get that experience that comes with enlisting and participating with the National Guard and the regular forces. That locally is something we need to work on and continue to make those connections so that our numbers stay strong here as well, both to preserve the culture, to make sure that there are stories like the ones you're telling that continue for generations, but also as a vehicle for advancement for Native folks by serving.
This is Tim Purton, who's the U.S. Attorney in North Dakota, and he's taken the lead in having a much stronger U.S. Attorney and judiciary presence on the reservations in North Dakota.
Well, that's exactly correct. Well, you got your finger right on it.
Well, I broke the clock right
We're going to allow one more question here if we can. I think you've got a question way in back. And then Herman does have a little special thing he wants to talk to us about because of the locality where we're at, close to Fort Abraham Lincoln, and he's got a couple more pictures he wants to show us. So we'll go with one more question, straight and back. There we go.
I would really just like to appreciate the fact that you brought this topic of reinterpreting the American West and the relationship between the Native population and the white population over time, because it's exactly what my history has been. My father was the Western novelist A.B. Guthrie, and I grew up in a house where if I answered the telephone, it might be somebody saying, white men would never do that to Indian women. And the fact that as a writer, he and his, the other writers and historians that he worked with and associated with were very interested in pursuing the idea of reinterpreting the Native perspective and what really happened in the Westering process through fiction. And so we spent a lot of time with historians and with other novelists looking at how you can present that to the wider public. And, you know, historians can't always reach the wider public. Novelists sometimes have a better opportunity to do that. And it was interesting to see your presentation today and seeing how far things have come in understanding in the bigger picture of the American West now. So I really appreciate
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Clay and I are going to move down here.
Well, wait, before I know he has
okay.
one more thing, but first of all, I'd like to talk with you about your father, but what's next? I mean, this book is now finished. What's your next big project?
Well, believe it or not, I'm working on a book on the history of Indian casinos. Believe it or not. And that's a whole different story, and but it's an important story, and it's not all bad. So.
Okay. Okay, we're going to move down here and.
Okay, this is one of those stories that just kind of fell in my lap. But I thought you ought to hear it because it's all about, well, it starts out with Fort Abraham Lincoln. But I was teaching school at Catholic University in the library science department, and one of my students, Charlotte White, came up one day after class and said, Dr. Viola, she said, you seem to know an awful lot about Indian history. Do you know much about the Battle of the Little Bighorn? And I said, well, sure, I know quite a bit. Why do you ask? And she said, well, my uncle was killed there. And I said, your uncle? I said, Charlotte, there's no way your uncle was killed at Little Bighorn. She said, well, no, it'd be my great uncle, but we still call him Uncle Willie in the family. And here's William Van Wyck Riley, second lieutenant. His body was found actually lying next to Custer's on Custer Hill. And so I said, well, Uncle Willie, I said, tell me more then. How could he be so close to the family? She said, we even have 3 of the letters he wrote home before he got killed at Little Bighorn. And no one has ever seen those letters. And so I said, well, let's learn more. So it turned out that William Van Wyck Riley's father had been a naval officer, and he had been killed in a shipwreck. And as the son of a naval officer, he was entitled to go to Annapolis, and he went and flunked out his first year. And his mother was very well-off socialite in Washington, D.C., and she was so embarrassed by her son having flunked out of Annapolis and destroying the family's military tradition that she went to the War Department and said, I have a very deserving son. Is there a commission available for him anywhere
in military service. And they said, this is your lucky day. We are just now beefing up for a major campaign against the hostile Indians. And yes, we could find him a commission. And so this lucky boy was made a second lieutenant in the 7th Cavalry and had to rush out to Fort Abraham Lincoln to catch up and get into his regiment. He did not even know how to ride a horse. And so anyhow, he wrote these 3 letters, which I have copies of. The family still has the letters. They wouldn't give them to the Smithsonian. So anyhow, the first letter was written right after the company, the troop, left the fort. They were on their way towards Indian country. And it's a long letter, but he says, you know, Mom, everything's really wonderful. The people here have been so nice to me. He said, but as the new officer here, my first assignment was to present my card to the wives of the other officers. And he said, I did. I went to every one of the officers' wives. And he said, what was puzzling is that they all are so depressed. And they have all bad feelings about the coming campaign. And yet they are wives of Civil War veterans. Their husbands have been in battle. So I'm rather puzzled. And he said, you know, Custer says nothing to worry about. This is a piece of cake. But he was writing this letter then on the way, and he said, now we're just out of sight of the fort, and the Arikara scouts are going to go back with the mail right now. So he said, I'm trying to get this letter written, but it's so hard to finish the letter because everybody's running up to me saying, what is the date? What's the date? I can't get time to think, but anyhow, I'm getting this into the mail so it goes out with the last scouts. So that was the first letter. The second letter is about several weeks later, and he says, Mom, everything is really wonderful. Tired. He said, we are really tired. Our horses are really fagged out. We haven't seen an Indian yet. Custer says, don't worry, we're going to see Indians. He said, but I want you to know that I did learn how to ride, and I've now ridden the meanest broncs in the regiment and have not been bucked off. And he said, and that's important because the 7th has a rule that if an officer is bucked off his horse, he pays for the drinks at the next stop. Now, right away, that said a lot to a historian because the one issue is, did Custer have whiskey? And everybody says, oh, no, there was no drinking. Well, this is a letter that says right away, you know, they were drinking, the officers were sure drinking. And so anyhow, he said, but, you know, we're making progress. And then the last letter was written June 24th, and it was the day before he got killed. And he says that, you know, still we haven't seen any Indians, but we have clear Indian sign. We are following a major trail. And the general says that we're going to have a fight in a day or two. And he said, and then I'll be able to come home. And he said, so plan on it. I'm taking you to Philadelphia for the 100th, the centennial celebration, you know, and we had, and that was the letter. And of course, we know what happened. You know, Sitting Bull changed the script. And when the bodies were found, William Van Wyck Riley was lying next to Custer. But that's not the end of the story. So anyhow, naturally, when she showed me these letters, I went to the National Archives and did research on Riley. And there was a nice large file on him. And in the file were letters from his mother. The mother was so horrified that her son had been killed, and she felt personally responsible for it. And it turned out that Riley was wearing the family heirloom ring, which belonged to Francis Scott Key, who had written the Star-Spangled Banner. And she insisted that the government return that ring to the family. Now, can you imagine? Now, because you have to realize there were a lot of widows made at Little Bighorn, and there were a lot of things that came in, but the government tried to make everybody happy. And so naturally, they sent a drawing of that ring out to every Indian installation, military installation in this region. And within a couple of months, an Indian wearing this ring on a leather thong surrendered at Fort Robinson, Nebraska.
And I'd hate to know what happened to the Indian, but they got the ring, and there was a big reward. And so it said then in the official records that the ring was returned to his mother. So I went back then to Charlotte, and I said, now there's a mystery here. It says that there was a ring, Francis Scott Key's ring, the rampant lion, but you can see it got cracked, the face of it got cracked. And it said that the ring went back to the mother. And what do you know about that? And she said, well, yeah, the family legend has it that the ring came back and that it was given to the Smithsonian Institution. So I went over to the Museum of American History, and I talked to one of the curators there, and I said, would there be a chance you have a ring from an officer in the 7th Cavalry? And he said, yeah, follow me. And he opened a drawer, and there it was. And so I then told the family, and we had a big family reunion. About a dozen of William Emmett Riley's descendants showed up. Everyone got to put the ring on and hold it. And so the moral of the story is that people have things in their homes that really are significantly important in American history. Being at the Smithsonian, I can't tell you how many times people have walked in my office with something that should have been in the Smithsonian. In fact, William Clark, for example, after he left was governor of Louisiana Territory, he had a seal that he used for sealing letters, and that still is in the family in Florida. They wanted $50,000 for it, and we couldn't afford it, but they had it. And so that's what goes on. But I'll finish with one, just to give you, even with mail. The mailman one time stopped me a couple of years ago, and he said, you live here? I said, yeah. He said, can I ask, you don't mind if I ask what you do for a living? And I said, well, yeah, I'm a curator at the Smithsonian. I said, why do you ask? He says, because you get such interesting mail. And so it shows these guys really do pay attention to, and he said, I thought you were involved with something like that. And he said, because one of my other clients who lives a couple blocks from you just inherited all this wonderful Civil War material, and he doesn't know what to do with it. So I went to see the fellow. His name was Meade Atkinson. He was named after General Meade from the Civil War. And Atkinson was a general who surveyed the boundary between between Texas and Mexico. And his grandmother had just died at the age of 104, and her closet was filled with old daguerreotypes, letters. In fact, one of his ancestors had been captain of the USS Constitution. One had been a head of Annapolis. And so I really wanted so much to give this stuff to the Smithsonian, but he said the trouble is the family had already brought in the stamp collectors, the dealers, and like one block of stamps from the USS Constitution, the dealer said it was worth $10,000. And so while I made the pitch, I never heard from him again, but I did see the stuff. And so people have things to this day that should be preserved, and so always make sure your family, even though you think grandma's trunk in the attic doesn't have anything, it just might. And so anyhow, there's a lesson for the day, but I'm sure out here there's a lot of good stuff that belongs in a museum somewhere. Thank you very much.
Before we wrap up, Herman, we thought it was really important that as long as you're coming to Bismarck State College, that you at least leave with something that says Bismarck on it. So for the cold weather today, we thought you might like a sweatshirt.
Well, this is great. See?
And Susan, we have one for you too.
This is just like the Indian tradition.
So what do I get back?
My goodwill.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.